Okay, so welcome again, Esther. And before we get started, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land that I am currently on in Ottawa, Ontario, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I would also like to acknowledge that you are all joining from many places near and far in our country, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of the lands. So with that, I'd like to pass it on to Esther, who's going to provide us with an overview of the social housing policy course and to answer any of the questions that you may have. I know you've only had a couple of weeks to review the course material, but just when you've started, if you have any questions leading into it. So thank you so much. And Esther, it's all yours.
Sure, thank you. It's okay that Dominica got our name wrong. There's actually 2 capital region housings in Canada. It makes it very confusing. So if you're located in British Columbia, Victoria does have a capital region housing as well. Sorry, my cell phone has some very long number calling it, so apologize for that. So we're the one located in Edmonton, which is Treaty 6 territory. We have, just for background, we are the largest social and affordable housing provider in Edmonton, with just over 5,200 units. And we also administer about 2,700 rent subsidies. So in Alberta, we have a portable benefit as well as one that is assigned to units as well. And we do that for the city of Edmonton and surrounding communities as well. The capital region, or Edmonton, also is home to about 40 different co-ops. And so we have a really strong co-op presence here in Edmonton, which is not typical across the entire province. Calgary has a much fewer number. So in terms of the sector here, this is sort of who we are. I'll just maybe get started unless someone has some like really burning question that they really wanted to ask right off the bat. Okay. Well, I just thought I would check, you never know, policy studies is that exciting. But let's start with that actual topic, which was sort of the focus for Module 1. We wanted to sort of introduce, because not everyone has worked in government and not everyone is familiar with how policy is actually developed, to sort of introduce to you the way that policy is organized and sort of goes through the process. You'll note that on the slide where I sort of talk about the process, which is sort of like a big circle with agenda setting as the first stage and around and around. It seems like it's a circular pattern or kind of linear. Just know that there can be lots of zigzagging back and forth between those processes, depending on what the policy is. So it just makes it very complicated as a picture to show that without any kind of background. So as you go through those sort of different stages, you can always be asked to go back to the drawing board, or go and get more engagement or more consultation, have a decision, those kinds of things. When we talk about policy, we often really think about the decisions that government makes and the actions that they take. And sometimes what we see and feel as policy, we don't necessarily recognize as such. So legislation is a form of policy or a way of implementing policy, but so is taxation. So all of those tax credits or incentives are also a way of modifying behavior and can also be part of a policy sort of impetus to try and sort of encourage behavior in one way or another. And so can other ways of communicating with Canadians. So doing PSAs or information kind of marketing strategies, that kind of thing. So you're not necessarily having to put anything down as a rule, but you're really trying to encourage people to go in one direction based on the information that they're seeing. So does anyone have any question about that? Okay, I'm also looking at the chat. So if you do send me a chat question, then I've got it open. So feel free to do that. Yeah, so when we talk about policy, it goes through these processes. It's good to sort of have an understanding of that, and then what we talk about in terms of policy windows. So right now we're actually seeing, in terms of housing, a really strong policy window opportunity that's as a result of sort of current events. So we generally will have regular policy windows sort of in the structure of government, sort of when they're doing their budget setting, or when we have a new election and a new government has been voted in, they have a new mandate. But in this case, with the pandemic, we have a really strong impetus to talk about the importance of home. And so as we're seeing all of the responses from different levels of government talking about how to deal with homelessness, our mayor in Edmonton, I don't know if anyone heard, has declared that we're going to fix homelessness in 9 weeks. Then it became 10 weeks, but we're now like on 5 weeks left. So we're going to see how that goes. And of course, you know, there's been lots of talk about the federal government making a lot of their plans for the fall session around building up housing, because it became such a big issue and the lack thereof became so apparent to so many Canadians. So when we're talking about windows of opportunity, those are the kinds of policy windows that we're talking about. It's not to say that if there's an issue and there's sort of a very small window that it's still not possible. It just could be much harder to move an item forward if you don't have the political will in the same way as when you have a really big policy window like we have right now. Okay. Does anyone have any other questions about Module 1? And we can go into a little bit more of an exciting topic about social housing. I mean, I'm excited about policy, but that's because I live and breathe policy stuff. So I can imagine, though, that not everyone is as excited about it as I am. So,
I just have
okay.
a general question. So you have the modules and then you have like resources. Is it like does the modules point to the resources that are in the folder? Like, does it say, you know, here's the module and then read these resources, and those resources are included in the package?
I included those resources if you wanted to do more reading than if.
Oh, so, okay, I understand.
Yeah, so I've taken a little bit from it, from some of those pieces, but also if you wanted to read more comprehensively about a particular issue, I wanted to make sure that there was resources available for anyone who wanted to do some deeper digging and didn't want to just try and go through Google.
Just go everything. So the modules are high level, dig into with the resources included. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Great, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, some of the plans, it would just be too much to like go through them all like plan by plan. So it's just easier to include a link for people to take a look at. So
Esther, we've lost you. You're frozen.
Oh, I'm frozen.
Okay, we hear you again.
Oh,
ooh.
Okay, good.
No, it's breaking up. Oh no.
All right.
Oh, there she is.
No, I turned it off because sometimes turning off the video will reestablish the connection for some very weird reason.
Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm getting a new modem on Tuesday. It's going to be very exciting. I'm hoping for it to take care of this problem. So when we're talking about the evolution of social housing policy, you know, we tend to, as a sector, or when we're talking about it, a lot of people will think of either the American experience or they'll think about the European or English context for how social housing operates. And it's important to know that our own history is very different insofar as social housing really emerged out of a need because of urbanization and was really actually directed towards those people who were coming into the cities and needing somewhere to live because they had jobs to go to. And so differently than in Europe and in England, which has a much larger sector, and largely because so much of their housing was destroyed after World War II, the impetus, of course, is very different. And I think that also goes to show why it hasn't reached the same sort of level of integration in our society as it has in some of the other countries. So a lot of people talk about Scandinavian countries where the degree of social housing or affordable housing is much, much larger. And in Canada, it never started out in the same way as a reason to have that kind of housing. And so we just haven't built it up. Now, that's not to say that there hasn't been demand over the years, but you can see how the shifting in sort of the way that we as Canadians and our Canadian governments have looked at social housing and the rationale for it has changed over the years. And so if you look through the module, and I tried to set it up in chronological order, in the 1960s and 70s, we have sort of the heyday of Canadian social housing policy, but also investment. So there was a lot of new buildings that were being built across the country, a lot of new sort of policy initiatives. So we saw a much greater interest in things like mixed income communities, where we had a diversity. That was also in response to a lot of concerns about the segregation of dedicated social housing compounds or complexes, and also the sort of concentration of poverty. That has also really pushed mixed income down in the States in a very particular way. But in Canada, it's been seen sort of as a way of just including more diversity in communities. The other thing that you'll see in Canada, most sort of across the country, is that our social housing that was built in the 60s and 70s are largely more integrated into our communities. So it's not like it's all in a downtown sort of 1 or 2 block radius. It's not at the edges of town like some of the social housing is in Australia, where you're really sort of cut off from the rest of the city. There are some of those examples, and that has a lot to do with land cost. But for the most part, those pieces of building in the 60s and 70s were really integrated in with other purpose-built rentals and other communities. And so there's been this really strong desire to have integration and diverse communities sort of from the get-go during our heyday. And then, you know, as with the rest of the world, you know, the 1970s and the 1980s ushered in sort of a new era. There was much more concern about the debt and the deficit that countries were carrying and governments were carrying. And just like many other social programs, things got started being rolled back. And social housing was no different. And in fact, one of the challenges that I would say is that we experience in social housing is that social housing is often thought of separately from the rest of the social programs that we sort of deal with. And so it's sort of its own little orphan, as we like to call it, when people gather around the table and talk about healthcare, education, and those kinds of things. For some reason, because housing has been commodified so much, and it's so home ownership driven in Canada, it tends to be in this sort of weird zone, even though social housing has been strongly associated with social programs. And so I think what we've seen there is also a bit of a separation of policy mandates and sort of recognition of needing to make sure that social housing evolves at the same rate and meets the needs of the people that are also using other social programs. So it was in the 80s that we also saw that because of concerns about deficit, they stopped building new units. And as a result, in order to deal with the demand, they decided to restrict the number of people who could be eligible. And so you have a lot of the sort of scaling back to people who are most in need. And that's where the definition of core housing need really came to be. And that's where you also saw the introduction as of the policy of 30%. At that time, it was 25%, and then later moved up to 28 or 30%, depending on the province you're in. But that shelter cost shouldn't be more than 30% of your gross income or the household's gross income. Anyone have any questions about that? I just sailed through decades of social housing policy, so, okay. Yeah, and so then we sort of saw this sort of really quiet period from sort of the 90s onwards, The federal government, in keeping sort of with the changes that we saw in the 80s, made a decision to devolve the assets and responsibility largely of social housing to the provincial government. We talk about the 90s in terms of that devolution, but we forget that at the same time, the provincial governments through the 70s and 80s were also gathering momentum in terms of taking on more responsibility of their constitutional responsibilities. And so there was sort of this jockeying of who is in fact responsible for social housing. And so they had planned at one point in the Charlottetown Accord to actually formally transfer responsibility over to the provincial governments. And of course, that accord never went ahead. And so that was never done, but it was done in practice, essentially, with the transfer of responsibility that happened in the 90s. And so when you look at the social housing systems in our provinces and territories, for the most part, you see systems that were built out of that time. So most of the legislation and the current frameworks were built in the mid-90s. And so have continued on with some tweaks and changes along the way, but for the majority, most are very still similar and are still rooted in that time where the provinces sort of took over. Ontario is different than the rest of the country in that it further devolved its responsibilities down to the municipal governments or its service managers. So if you are from Ontario, just know that that's actually not a standard arrangement across the rest of the country. I find that sometimes people, if they don't realize that, get really confused when we're talking in other contexts about other provinces because they're not sure why there's greater involvement from the provincial government. Exactly, Terry. So that was definitely a Harris government decision. It was before Harper's time, actually, before they transferred it over, but definitely an Ontario government decision to set it up with the service managers. And, there's some debate as to whether that works better or not. One of the big thoughts about how a lot of our sectors sort of systems work is that it really wants to set up where there's a local sort of influence so it can better meet those local needs. Whether it does or not is a different question. But I know for sure in Alberta's case, for instance, the way that they set up what they call housing management bodies, which is the housing associations, they really pushed to try and make the decision-making at a local level, or at least about making governance decisions at a local level. And so you'll have this mishmash of organizations across the country that have different sort of legislative requirements and different ways of being created and different responsibilities in terms of reporting back to the provincial government as a result. So there's similarities across all of the provinces and territories, but then you also have a number of differences as well. And then you're starting to see a further, I wouldn't use the term devolution, because that we sort of use that term, I think, in the experience of the 90s and sort of talk about it as like just pushing down to the provinces. But we're starting to see more of a recognition of the importance of Indigenous self-determination and self-governance in the areas of housing off reserve. And so if you look at British Columbia, for instance, they have essentially, they use the terminology devolved as well, but they've transferred all of the responsibility for the assets to Indigenous-led organizations. And so we're starting to see more and more of that recognition that it's important for Indigenous housing to be Indigenous owned, managed, and led. And they often will have much more support services embedded and cultural practices embedded in their housing than we do sort of across the rest of the social housing spectrum. Any questions about that? Okay, am I going too fast for people? All right. So during the 90s, social housing, like I said, after the devolution occurred, really sort of took a back seat. In the 2000s, under Harper's government, there was sort of a resurgence of what was called affordable housing, which everyone enjoys because we all use that term interchangeably sometimes with social housing. And now, of course, we use the term community housing to mean both. social housing and affordable housing. So I always suggest if you're talking to someone about affordable housing, ask them what they mean by affordable housing. The affordable housing programs in the 2000s were a lot of grant programs to build new affordable housing, but the affordable housing, the grant agreement was essentially that the rents had to be less than at least 10% of market. So it's very different than the deeply subsidized social housing that we see that still exists. And so when we talk about affordability, there's still a huge segment of our population that is actually not finding the affordable housing affordable because the rents are still too high. They're affordable for some who may not be eligible for the deeply subsidized housing. Yeah, it was 25% of income. Well, it's actually 30, it's still 30% for most of our rules. But yes, now they're also starting to say 33%, just looking at Terry's comment in the chat about the threshold that we see. That threshold is also used in the mortgage rules as well. It's used not just in our sector, but across when you're looking at whether or not someone should be owning a house or having adequate shelter costs. So sorry, I digress. So the affordable housing, that's why I say like it's always important. Sorry, my dogs are going crazy. I live across the street from an elementary school, and so I have no control over getting them to stop barking in the middle of the day. So I apologize if you can hear them on the mic. We haven't really seen much attention being given to social housing itself, the deeply subsidized, until the Liberals took office in 2015 and brought with them that energy towards creating the National Housing Strategy that was released in 2017. We've seen at the provincial level, a number of provincial governments have done housing strategies. Some have done it where it's dedicated only to affordable or social housing. Some have done it as a more holistic housing strategy where they're also talking about working with builders and developers in the realm of homeownership. So it really depends on the province and sort of the scope that they chose for their particular strategy. But when the federal government came out with their national housing strategy, first they had done a huge consultation with Canadians in a number of different channels to sort of get a sense of what Canadians wanted out of the first ever national housing strategy that Canada released. And there had been many, many calls for one as we saw an increase of need and also an increase of homelessness that was starting to take shape in the 90s and the 2000s. So we now have this national housing strategy. It comes with a number of resource and investment promises. So there's a number of grant funds that are now available for housing providers to take advantage of, whether that's to retrofit existing buildings or build new. They also recognize that there is a real lack of information and data and knowledge about the sector in Canada. And so while in other countries, there's really strong research and sort of policy traditions around the area of social housing and affordable housing, there's been some in Canada, but it's more so focused on homelessness and permanent supportive housing. There hasn't been as much concentration on social housing and affordable housing. And so the federal government through the National Housing Strategy has also emphasized the need to really build up that knowledge base within the country so that we can make more evidence-based decisions and have a better sense of how to move forward, because of course, hard to move forward if you don't know where you've been. And so we are now seeing, the first sort of rollouts of some of those initiatives. There's a huge award of research dollars earlier this year to a number of academics and community partners.
You froze again.
The regular.
Esther, you might have to do your camera trick.
Yeah, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Sorry, guys. I could kind of get something up because everyone sort of like started laughing again, and I was like, oh, I cut out.
I have to move my entire kitchen table over into my living room to plug into the modem because the internet is always kind of like, ooh, will it or will it not shut down? So I purposely So I've lifted my table, I have moved it. I am currently in the living room with my dining room table, even though it's technically all the same room anyways.
But still, it does require some maneuvering of things, lovely technology that allows us to do all of this, but also allows us to be interrupted constantly while we're trying to get through a discussion. Yeah, and so does anyone have any questions about the National Housing Strategy and sort of where we're at with things? Okay. You know, a lot of it is still really, oh, sorry, thanks, Lisa. Permanent supportive housing. So if you think about housing on a spectrum, here, I'll put my hands in the frame. That might be easier. And, you know, you either use the umbrella term that the federal government is now using, which is community housing, or the old one, affordable housing. At one end of the spectrum, you have the shelters and sort of the emergency housing pieces. And then as you move up the spectrum or the continuum, you start going into more permanent housing options. And so the permanent supportive housing is deeply subsidized housing or somewhat subsidized housing, but also has embedded with it a lot of supports. And so it's part of the housing package that you get, usually traditionally focused on helping people with mental health or addictions barriers. And in terms of the permanent supportive housing target demographic, often it is the first step after transitional housing for those who've been chronically homeless. It helps sort of stabilize and provide those supports and not leaving people stranded, because in social housing, while you can have supports, they're not embedded in your housing in the same way. And so if you need something in the middle of the night, they're not there. Lindsay asks about any updates on the National Housing Council. No, nor has there been any updates on the Federal Housing Advocate, unless you know anything, Dominica. But
we had our Housing on the Hill yesterday, CHRA did, and that question was asked of both the minister, Minister Hussen, as well as some MPs, and the response was not much better than yours, Esther. It was, the Housing Council is with CMHC right now, so they're currently hiring, and I think they're putting together the actual staff to support the Housing Council, but they're waiting on the government to actually press the button on go. In terms of the Housing Advocate, nothing. It's quiet right now. So until the government announces something, we have no idea when that's coming. But the Housing Council should be rolling in the near future.
Okay, well, that's good. I mean, I know they had done their call out for applications to both. You know, a lot of that is appointments and orders in council. So I'm assuming that some of that is the delay is due to being a minority government and prioritization of items going to things around COVID. So, yeah, the National Housing Council, the Federal Housing Advocate, who's actually supposed to be supported by the same staff as the Canadian Human Rights Commission, as I understand it. You know, those offices, once we know who's sort of in them, I think they'll be able to sort of set the trend. Similarly, the National Housing Strategy talked about creating a rights-based framework. And so we talk a lot about the right to housing. I have a legal background, and so for me, when we talk about rights, it's also really important to make sure that people understand how they can be enforced. I don't think we're there yet. And the right to housing that's contained, the language that's contained in the legislation that has proclaimed this right, is actually a right to adequate housing. And so we're all very curious how that is going to be implemented and what that means for people who are looking for housing, as well as those who provide housing. Because as you can imagine, a right to housing is very different than a right to adequate housing. And so it just, time will tell, as along with the National Housing Council and the Federal Housing Advocate, sort of how that's going to be, like I said, either implemented or integrated across rules across the country, and how the provinces are going to be working with the federal government on that is also a good question. It's in their agreements that they've signed, the bilateral agreements under the National Housing Strategy for their funding, but what that'll look like in practice and on the ground. And from my perspective, what does that mean for the person who needs housing is still up in the air. Likewise, there's been some talk about the Canada Housing Benefit. A couple of provinces have actually released theirs and have designed it. So Saskatchewan is one, Ontario has done it. Some of the other provinces are still designing out what their Canada Housing Benefit will look like. And Saskatchewan's benefit looks very different than that of Ontario. So in Saskatchewan, the benefit is actually eligible to only those who are living in some form of nonprofit or subsidized housing, or affordable housing. And whereas in Ontario, it's much more driven towards private sector renting, and sort of dealing with it that way. So that might also be just a reflection of the housing stock overall available to the population, or just decisions within different governments. So I mentioned that we are sort of now moving forward with the National Housing Strategy. The other piece that the National Housing Strategy really did is they identified the priority populations that they're focusing on. And one of those is, of course, those who are experiencing homelessness. They are also using a GBA plus approach, which is gender-based analysis plus. The plus is the important part, because while gender is in the name of the sort of approach that they're taking, the plus is referencing the fact that they're looking at all sorts of different identities, not just gender. And so essentially in practice, what that means is that they're looking at how their decisions, how programs and policies that are rolling out are impacted, or how they impact people at different intersections of their life. So whether they are young, a veteran, and experiencing homelessness, as opposed to someone who may be an elderly person with a disability who is, searching for a safe haven after experiencing family violence. So the experience that one person has because they belong to one identity group, such as females, doesn't mean that it's all of the same experience when you take into consideration the other identities and the experiences that we have. And so when we talk about GBA plus, that's what that's referring to. And with the priority populations, they're also really understanding that people come from all different experiences and experience a number of different barriers. But for policy purposes, you sort of need to put a line in the sand. And so what they've done is they've identified their priority populations for this iteration of the National Housing Strategy to sort of really focus on those who are in greatest need for stable and safe housing. And then ostensibly down the road, they're going to be working on broadening that. So that will also be interesting. There's a number of reporting requirements that the government has imposed on themselves as well, along with the National Housing Strategy, to see how they're doing and how they're meeting their objectives. And I don't think we've sort of seen any examples of those reporting. Most of them are sort of at the 5-10 year mark, and will also come through the National Housing Council and the Federal Housing Advocate, but just know that they're coming. And so we'll be able to see a bit of a report card on what the strategy outlined and what is happening in reality. And then similarly, Module 4, we talk about sort of how homelessness interacts with social housing. I don't think anyone would disagree that people who are experiencing homelessness need safe and affordable housing. And, it's just not as easy as, sort of just putting someone in a shelter or in a dwelling and expecting them to thrive. So it's also about making sure that all of their net needs are met. And so some of the strategies along dealing with homelessness is recognizing that there's just some additional barriers that exists for a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness, and a recognition that there is a lot of hidden homelessness as well. So we don't often talk about the people who are necessarily couch surfing or staying in a motel because they can afford it. Where usually when people say those experiencing homelessness, they're thinking of rough sleepers. And yes, while that's an important demographic, so too are the people who don't feel like they have a secure home, call home, because they're in such a transitory setup, in terms of their housing. And then lastly, the last module will just take you through some of the Indigenous housing history. There's on reserve and off reserve, of course, housing and the different responsibilities of such. The federal government has essentially retained responsibility for on reserve housing in collaboration with the First Nations governments, as much as you can say collaboration with the Indian Act. But off reserve, as I said, we're starting to see an increase in recognition of the importance of Indigenous led and managed housing. In Ontario, the Ontario strategy has come out in terms of moving more and more towards that. And that link is included in the module. And I think we're also starting to see First Nations also starting to create housing options for members of their nation who may be living off reserve. So I know, for instance, a good example of that is the Treaty 7 Housing Authority in Calgary. That actually is being set up to deal with off reserve housing, but for Treaty 7 members. And so just recognizing that they have housing needs off reserve and that they're in the best position to provide that. There are very strong calls for a dedicated Indigenous housing strategy. And in fact, CHRA has been really leading that way with Indigenous Caucus. But we just have not yet seen that come through or be confirmed yet by CMHC that it will be something that is in short order. So that's sort of still one of those time will tell kind of things. So I think that's kind of a quick overview of the 5 different modules. You can ask a question that is not part of those modules if that is of interest to you as well. The experiencing visible homelessness. I'd say there's probably, maybe not a minority, but certainly I think there's a larger number of people who are experiencing homelessness than we recognize because they're not as visible. The other demographic that from a policy perspective we should be really focusing on are the people who are literally one paycheck away from experiencing homelessness. So, we saw that with the huge response when we went into lockdown about how many people suddenly couldn't afford rent. But in terms of sort of overall, I think if we didn't have the pandemic, we probably wouldn't be as aware of how close and how precarious people's housing situations are. And so hopefully that brings out that demographic of those who are so close to being homeless. The other challenge, of course, is going to areas where the housing costs are so high that even if you are working, there's no way that you can afford safe and affordable housing in the marketplace, and that the demand is so high that there's long lists. So I'm thinking of, in particular, Vancouver and Victoria. So you hear a lot about people who have moved out for work and then can't find housing, so they're living in a car or they're living in an RV. We sort of, there's a lot of discussion right now about what to do with tent cities. They're starting to build up again. And so it'll be interesting to see what the policy response will be. I personally don't think it's as easy as just buying a bunch of buildings. You want people to live with dignity and be proud of the home that they're living in. And so how do we achieve that while also meeting the needs of all of the different people who are in housing need? One of the areas of affordable housing that we often sort of overlook is the cooperative sector. And some of that I think is just because it's also been traditionally dealt with separately from social housing. And so when we usually talk about affordable housing, most people sort of have blinders on and they're sort of really thinking about the housing providers and whether they're not-for-profits or sort of an extension of government. But the co-op sector also provides affordable housing, and depending on the co-op, it can be deeply subsidized. Some have access to the subsidies that are offered through the provincial governments, in addition to subsidies that they're receiving themselves as a co-op. And so, for instance, we work closely with our co-ops to do sort of referrals. So if we know that we have a co-op in the city that has available vacancies, then if we have people who are coming to seek out housing, we can always refer them there as another alternative for affordable housing. And so I think, you know, they're also facing the end of operating agreements, just like a lot of social housing providers are. There's a lot of question around what that means for that sector. I think there's probably been way more attention on the impact of expiring operating agreements for social housing providers. But those groups tend to
You have to do your trick again.
Sorry, guys. So yeah, so what I was saying is just, you know, just like sort of affordable housing or subsidized housing is sort of an orphan of sort of greater social policy, I find that there's still a policy disconnect between the co-op sector and the greater social housing sector. And, you know, and some of that is for good reason. Co-ops have a much different focus around the community in their living setup than necessarily social housing does. But when we're talking about social inclusion and economic inclusion, I think there's a lot of good examples from the co-op sector in terms of how they've really created community in their co-ops that we can learn from. And so it's just a matter of starting to look at more of the similarities than necessarily the differences that separate the two sort of sectors. But it's definitely on the continuum. It just tends to be an overlooked part of the continuum. Any other questions?
I think there's one from Lindsay in the chat.
Oh, yes. Drug policy, advocacy, and housing policy. That's a good question. I think there has been, I find that the overlap is more so insofar as the criminalization of poverty. So a little bit broader than just drug policy. I think that's part of it. But just an overall recognition that we have a lot of rules in place that criminalize people for being poor. You know, around sort of tickets if they're caught on transit without having paid the transit fare, you know, loitering bylaws and things like that. And so I find that there's a little bit more overlap that way, particularly from those who are in the homelessness policy sector. That has strong advocacy that way in terms of dealing at that more holistically. In terms of the sort of more sort of structured social housing sector, I think one of the challenges that sector experiences is that in addition to providing subsidized housing and recognizing that our tenants have, you know, significant barriers in a lot of cases, we also have legal obligations put on us as a landlord. And so just like any other landlord, including in the private market, there's certain rules and obligations that you have not only to your individual tenants, but to the entire complex as well. And so that can often pit landlords and their tenants in terms of addressing social behavioral issues or drug use issues or any kind of criminality that's happening on site. Whereas you may have a landlord who has a little bit more latitude for some issues, just can't because it's putting others within the complex at risk. And then so as a landlord, you're obligated to think about them just as much as you are the individual tenant. But what we did a research project last year about eviction prevention strategies. We talk a lot about that in the sector around eviction prevention. And so while this is really contained to just the Edmonton experience, because our grant was for people in Edmonton, what we found is that for the most part, social housing landlords really go a long way to avoiding eviction. So whether that's working at length with the tenant and trying to get them back into routine, whether that's paying their rent or not having any destruction in their unit or damaging their unit, or dealing with the social behaviors that are creating challenges. And so everyone we talked to, eviction was sort of that step of last resort that they really didn't want to go to. So much so that some social providers didn't even track how many evictions that they did, because it was so much, one in a blue moon, that they didn't feel the need to track them. So I think you also sort of see different ways in which the landlords will try and support their tenants without necessarily going sort of a formal advocacy sort of with particular different types of policy. It tends to be more sort of directed at the individual household. I don't know if that answered your question, Lindsay.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Sure. I mean, I would say the other thing too is that there's a huge discussion right now as to whether the need for social housing is a supply question in terms of the number of housing units we have, or whether it's an income question and a poverty question. And so I think we're starting to see the play out of that conversation now, even more so. There's greater and greater sort of calls for a guaranteed basic income. So what does that mean, and what are the long-term impacts and implications for social housing as a result, or other forms of affordable housing? And so I think we're at a really interesting crossroads on this. Is we've sort of traditionally, I think, always seen it as a supply-demand issue, as opposed to an income or sort of other societal impact issue. So now that we're looking at things a little bit broader, it should be interesting to see if we see different solutions. Any other questions? All right.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Esther, and thanks for everyone who joined. I just saw that Eddie just joined us, but I think maybe Eddie, you thought it started at 3:30 Eastern time?
No, I actually
okay.
I just woke up because I work nights. Sorry.
Sorry.
I'm really sorry.
Oh no, don't apologize. We did record, so you'll be able to take a look at the recording afterwards. I'll be sending that to all of the tenant leadership group participants. But I wanted to thank Esther for the presentation. I think that was an excellent overview of the various modules that she developed for the social housing policy course. And as you're going through the modules, like, be sure to keep in contact in Slack around any questions or feedback that you have. And then we can bring the group together to have discussions about the various modules and questions that do come up. I think I think you're all in Slack. I'm not entirely sure, but I did create channels for each module. So if there's something specific about that module that you want to know more about, just feel free to send the message in there and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you again, Esther, and thanks to all the participants, and we'll be in touch about the next session for this group.
Sure.
Thanks again.
No, it was great. It was great I heard about CHRA putting together the tenant leadership group, and it was really exciting to hear about. So it's great to meet some of you, albeit disjointedly because my internet kept kicking out. But I hope that you guys have a great rest of the year while you're moving through the group program. Is that what you guys are calling it?
The tenant leadership group program, yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday, everyone.
Sure. Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.
And Lisa, I'll talk to Dominica about doing a revisit after you guys have a chance to talk about the materials.
Okay. All right. Bye.
Okay, bye.